So great to be with you again at PAFAO, this time in its new online incarnation. And congratulations, Al, on this new platform. Thank you so much for making it that much more accessible to people around the world. And happy Monday, everyone. Hello from Boston, where it's a little bit overcast, but a lot of energy and information and insights coming from the laptop through this platform. So thank you for that. A shout out to everyone who is either waking up early or staying up late to watch the program. Thank you for investing the next 50 minutes or so with me as I speak. Now, PAFAO attracts people from all parts of HR and all parts of people analytics, and also from different stages in their careers. And so, what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about some guidance on people analytics careers, but in a somewhat indirect sense. So I wanted to bring it back to the situation that we find ourselves in today, and then also look at it from the standpoint of strategy. So let's dive right into it because we don't have too much time, and I do want to leave plenty of room at the end for questions. And I hope you'll also be typing in questions as I speak, and I'd be happy to address all of them as well. So 2020, what a year it's been, and still so much more to come. Who knows what lies in store for us in the next couple of months as we close out the year. So it's a time of great distress around the world, and I do hope that each one of you is taking the time to look after yourselves. Remember, you've got to use a mask on yourself first before you begin to help other people. And self-care, looking after yourself, is just vital at this time. Now, the global pandemic has led us to refocus on health and well-being, especially for the frontline workforce, which in the pre-pandemic days was sort of in the background for most folks, and quite candidly, in lots of conferences. And so we have a newfound sense of gratitude and respect for all of those frontline workers in healthcare and distribution and retail and other sectors. There's been so much economic dislocation as well. Entire economies have been affected, markets, particularly the labor market, organizations, and individuals, whether you're a worker, a consumer, a leader, manager, a tremendous dislocation from an economic standpoint. And in the US in particular, we have to rededicate ourselves to the very important work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So all of the stuff that's going on in this world right now brings to mind a line from a poem by William Butler Yeats called Easter 1916, about 100 years ago, totally different situation. But I think it captures what's happening. All changed utterly, right? And some of you may actually remember the next line in this poem. So it's all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. A terrible beauty is born. And I think it's really up to people analytics and practitioners like everybody in the call today to make sure that the future of work is less terrible and more beautiful for everyone. And that's why PAFAO is especially relevant because it's all about people data for good. So thank you, Al, again, for that focus, which is so, so important. So everything is changing utterly. Now what do we do? So it brings to mind then the fundamental question for people analytics, for leadership actually, which is now what? This is when everyone looks to leadership and is looking for answers and looking for a path. And so leadership becomes that much more important. And in particular, at this time, I think what I call adaptive leadership, where leaders need to help their employees or their followers, if you will, adapt to a totally different environment and relieve their distress. Right? So leadership is critical, but I'm not going to talk about leadership right now, maybe some other time. What I want to focus on is strategy. And what I want to try and do is talk about strategy from the standpoint of people analytics, but also your role as a people analytics practitioner. So strategy. But before we go to strategy, let's just take a little bit of a moment because there is so much distress, so much happening in the world today. And David, you published, I think last week, your monthly best people analytics articles. And you actually began with a reflection that you are so busy, much busier than before, right? And I agree with you, between work, meetings, Zoom calls, one after the other, and personal responsibilities, it's hard to find time to do anything else. Now, for many people, that's not really different from the past, but I would submit that right now, it's so important for all of us to make some time for ourselves and reflect. So, reflection is really a forgotten thing. And I'd like to remind you, using some words from an American philosopher of the last century, uh, about what reflection is. It's really something that's important for people analytics in particular, because as you sit back and think and reflect, it really helps you make meaning of what you're observing in the data. It nourishes our curiosity as we try and come up with the important questions to ask. And it's really how we put things together and learn and come up with the insights that are so valuable for our customers. And it's also something that we do both individually as ideas bounce around in our head, as well as with our teammates as we innovate and try and change things. And it's really how we all grow as we make connections and come to realizations, both individual and professional. So I would really urge you to try and make some time for yourself during the day, the evening, whenever, to reflect. And I think you'll be a better people analyst, a better manager, a better employee, a better leader, a better human being if you invest some time in reflection. So now back to strategy. And everything has changed utterly. Now what? So when I think of strategy, I like to simplify it and think of it in terms of 5 basic elements. Here they are. Players, competition, choice, uncertainty, and time frame. Now, you only need strategy if there's more than one player. And a player could be an individual, it could be an organization. Players have objectives. They have a certain purpose that they're trying to achieve. And players invariably come into competition with one another because resources are limited. And so not every player will be able to fulfill their purpose. As a result, we often have winners and losers, but not necessarily. Competition also includes cooperation. Now, each player has a series of choices to make, and these choices will have consequences. So they have to be very careful about what choices they make, and often these choices are dependent upon what other players' choices are or will be. And what makes strategy really interesting is uncertainty. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what the other player's purpose is. You don't know what the other player's motivations and next step will be. So uncertainty becomes something that you have to contend with. And then finally, there's time frame, which makes you think about time in segments and often forces players to make a choice within the time frame, whether it's an annual plan, a 3-year plan, or a 5-year plan. So here are the elements of strategy. Let's dive into each one of them. And what I'll try and do is extract something that will help you think about what you might be wanting to focus on at this time in people analytics. So, in the past, I've spoken about people analytics and poetry. I've spoken about people analytics and particle physics. And I think it's time to now complete the trilogy and talk about people analytics and power. People analytics and power. What does that mean? Well, in the context of players and competition, we all have stakeholders as we try and move our project forward. And it's so important to try to keep in mind that you have to think about this from a very strategic standpoint. So when we talk about power, everyone really has to be aware of their stakeholders' individual goals as well as their organizational goals and strategy before you begin to try and formulate your own people analytics strategy and people analytics roadmap. So you have to think of it also in terms of what's in it for me, for your stakeholders. Otherwise, you're not going to get cooperation, not going to get buy-in. So thinking of stakeholders in the sense will really help you pull your program together and move it forward. Now, it's especially important in situations where either the organization or the HR function is not necessarily yet data-driven. So it does get better, but you may face a lot of resistance in the beginning. And you have to keep in mind also that you are engaged in a big program of change. Certainly change management, but more importantly, change leadership. And you'll find resistance from all kinds of places that you never expected. So you've got to be careful about the power structure and the power lines within your organization. Now, not everything is, in a sense, political. There's many other reasons why you might face resistance. And it brings to mind the second law of workforce, which I published, I think, in 2015. And this law says that the consumption of workforce analytics requires time and effort. And it may seem fairly innocuous, it may not seem particularly useful, but in my experience, we often underestimate how much energy non-people analytics folks, the recipients of our results, have to invest in order to make sense of what we show them. And we may make it easier for them in terms of dashboard or platform, so everything is available. But that too makes it difficult because now there's so much information to consume and to digest. And so we often think once we have the dashboard in place that our work is done. But no, we actually have to work even harder to help people understand the data, the implications, and what to do next. Now, one thing you should also keep in mind is that as people analytics practitioners, we have a lot of power. Knowledge is power, and we sort of understand everything in the organization. We see the data, we know what's going on. And with this power comes great responsibility. And again, echoing Al's sentiments of people data for good is very, very important. So we've talked about the first two elements of strategy, and let's move on to the third element, which is choice. Now, when I try and explain people analytics, I like to use this schematic, and it'll take you a second to sort of read into this. But people analytics really pervades the entire organization and what it does. It always begins with strategy on the left-hand side, business strategy, where we determine which markets to play in, how to price our goods and services, workforce strategy, what sort of employment contract will we have with our workers, where will we set up shops, to what extent will we implement automation, and then HR strategy. What are the programs that we will have to run our HR organization? These, if you will, are the choices that we make from a strategic standpoint. And on the right-hand side, you have the consequences: customer outcomes, operational outcomes, and financial outcomes. So this is where we're always thinking about the business outcome of our work. And it's really important to focus on the three middle boxes, because this is what makes the connection from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. We really have to understand what employees have in terms of their skills and abilities, what employees do in terms of their behavior in the company, and finally, what employees feel. And I would submit that in this time, what employees feel is the most important thing that we can try and measure and try and understand. Now, as an economist, I like to use the paradigm of constrained optimization. And so constrained because we have resource constraints and other constraints. It's multivariate because we're looking at many different variables at the same time. It's nonlinear because often the relationships between the variables are complex. It's stochastic because there's uncertainty involved. And it's dynamic because everything is moving all the time and all the interrelations keep changing as well. So we're trying to optimize many, many different kinds of things. I think we've seen that employee experience is becoming something really important to look at and a lens through which we bring people analytics to the table. Inclusion and diversity are always important and increasingly so today. The mix of the workforce, really any sort of thing we're trying to make better or decide what's the right amount. And certainly everyone has cost as a constraint as well. So we're trying to optimize that. But we're also given certain constraints. What is the nature of work? What are skills? What skills do we have? What skills do we need? What are these things called jobs and how are they evolving in the current environment? How do we measure performance? What do we think about worker development, teams, careers, demography for sure. Demography is destiny, but now also biology with the advent of COVID-19. And of course, we all have budget constraints. And then we have to think of all the different conditions as well that are out there in the world in terms of social and organizational issues, artificial intelligence, automation, the pattern of change that we're seeing in the world. And this is all being done over time. And we also have nature as a player playing its hand. And that tells us then how we need to perhaps reconfigure and rethink our entire process or thought process. So constraint optimization is a pretty useful paradigm with which to look at the problems we have and that we're trying to solve for in people analytics. So now let's move to the fourth aspect of strategy, which is uncertainty. And we've already seen that nature is a player in the game and will deal us a hand as she's dealt us in 2020, which is quite tough. Now, one antidote to uncertainty is information. And I like to argue that we need to strive towards, as much as we can, this concept of full information, collecting more data, if you will. And collecting more data has a cost, and there's a limit to which you want to take this. But information is a normal good. More is better. And so you really need to have an idea of where you're going to get information and what new channels can you use to provide information to shed light on your problem. So in terms of information, thinking back to that box, the three boxes in the middle of the chart, we need to know what do employees have, what are their career aspirations, for example? What do employees do in terms of how do they collaborate? How do they work in a remote environment? And what do employees think? Do they feel they're included? Do they feel like they still belong to an organization even though they're working remotely? So these are things that you have to delve deeper into. And I would argue also that we need to pay a little bit more attention to qualitative research. So we've really added a lot of quantitative analysis as people analytics practitioners. But I think at this point, and especially when you look at the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you collect information at the surface level on representation, on mobility, various different things. But you really have to understand the lived experience that people have. And you can't get that from the numbers. So qualitative research through interviews, through focus groups, through other means really gets at the lived experience and how people actually feel, the spaces in between the questions that are asked in a survey. So I think qualitative research is going to be very important. And you see now more and more organizations hiring into their people analytics teams, anthropologists, sociologists, ethnographers, because these skills also help us to sort of come to terms with culture, get a handle in culture, understand what it is, how it's changing, and how to influence it. So full information is really the order of the day. And this notion of full information, therefore, creates a lot of demand on our employee sensing teams, or the survey teams, or employee listening teams, because they're the ones who are really charged with trying to understand how employees feel, what they're thinking. And there's been quite a bit of discussion this morning about what's the best way to do it, what are some ways you can use to complement various aspects of information you pull out about employees. And I would say that you really have to, again, think of full information. And certainly you have surveys, but more and more, I'm realizing that we have to dig deeper, and organizational network analysis is becoming especially important. I'm pleased to see that in today and tomorrow, we have quite a few presentations on ONA. We had one this morning with Madhura and Manish. And I think there are some more either later today or tomorrow. But organizational network analysis is going to be really, really important for employee listening teams. And so ONA is also quite vital when we try and unpack some things around diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organizations. And again, from a full information standpoint, try to complement the active data from surveys with passive data collection through aspects of organizational network analysis. Now, we can certainly try and reshape our thinking around the survey-based activity. There was a discussion earlier about whether annual surveys are still needed. I think they are. I agree with Stacey on that point. There are different means for different situations, but I think we have to be very careful now about what we ask. And I think we should not necessarily be at this point right away asking about productivity. We should be asking about how people are feeling and making sure that we're trying to see signs of distress and address it as soon as we can. But in terms of passive ONA, you have different approaches. So you can certainly look at email and calendar metadata. This is what TrustSphere, for example, does, one of the leaders and pioneers in ONA. And they can extract incredible insights just from looking at the metadata. But if you have had the conversation and the agreement with your employees and stakeholders about delving a little bit deeper into the message content, then you have the opportunity to extract sentiment and, again, complement the information that you have from surveys and from passive, other passive ONA methodologies. And companies like R Squared are looking at sentiment analysis in ONA. So that brings us to the final element of strategy, which is time horizon. Let's get into that. So this is really, if you think about it, when you put a time frame on something, you're thinking about workforce planning, right? And so here's a very simple, quick and dirty definition that I use for workforce planning. And in my experience, companies have by and large solved for the first two aspects of capacity and mix. What they're having difficulty with, and which is almost the last mile of workforce planning, is the capability. And capability is really vital to solve for. So when you talk about workforce planning, it really means different things to different people. And so let's take a second to just identify the three types of planning. There's strategic workforce planning, which leads the business, has a longer time frame. It's really more about the future, and it's all about strategy, choices that you're going to make now and later. There's operational workforce planning, which is about managing the business. It's more of an annual plan and lives in the present, and it's really about the budget, the annual budget you're trying to manage towards. And then there's tactical workforce planning, which is running the business. It's looking at things at a more granular level, and it's more immediate. It's things like staffing a shift or a retail store. And I do believe that we've sort of ignored tactical workforce planning for quite a bit. And now it's become very important as we try and move people back into the office. and figure out when they can be there, what's the time frame, what's the right mix. Tactical workforce planning is going to become very, very important. So let's talk about strategic workforce planning. There are many ways to do it, many aspects to it, but I want to actually just talk about two aspects. One is related to internal mobility, which is all about solving for the capabilities dimension of workforce planning. And the other one is scenario planning. So let's dive into each one. So internal mobility becomes important because the labor markets right now are dislocated. It's not always easy or cheap to find people. And so your internal talent pool becomes more important. Turnover is still expensive, and it makes much more sense to look for people within. Your best candidate probably already works for you. So internal mobility becomes very important. Also, as you try and address diversity, equity, and inclusion, because often it's very much like a leaky bucket, and you bring people in, but they don't feel like they belong, they leave, and they constantly have to fill the bucket with new hires. If you think about internal mobility and try and find opportunities for people within the company and make them feel like they belong, then you've solved that problem. And also, we're finding that in many cases, what's top of mind for people, especially early career, is their career path. And so if you can give them some picture of their career path internally, create that internal labor market, create that internal talent market, you'll be able to assuage that need, give people the information they need, and they're more likely then to stay with you. So this is where artificial intelligence comes into play, and artificial intelligence can really help by identifying possibilities for individuals, what's available, what's been done in the past, what's out there in the future, and also helps to make the right match between employees and opportunities. And again, not just now, but in the future, depending on what the future skills needs will be and what individuals' own future skills attributes will be as well. And then finally, this aspect of strategic workforce planning, which is scenario planning. Now, scenario planning is nothing new. It's been around since the 70s when Shell Oil used it really successfully during the oil crisis. But it goes in and out of favor. And it's not something that you can just suddenly pick up and do. There is a discipline. You probably need to have someone, an expert, come help you do it for the first time. And it requires a lot of thought. But what scenario planning allows you to do is really question the assumptions that you have. And remember, all of our assumptions now have to be questioned because the world is so entirely different. Question the assumptions and think about alternative futures, but not just what those futures might be, but answer really powerful questions like, which is the future that we want to avoid, the bad future? How do we make sure through strategy that we avoid that outcome? Or what's the future for an organization that we really want? And how do we make sure, given various conditions at the outside, how do we make sure that we steer towards that outcome, regardless of other things going on? So scenario planning becomes so, so important. And I would encourage folks to open up those old textbooks and those old articles and revisit scenario planning. So just to sum up the things I've been speaking about in the last 20 minutes or so. Number one, very important, reflect, make the time, because no one is going to give you the time to do this. And so make the time between meetings, set up some time to do it on your calendar, but reflect. Just take everything in, let it mix around in your head, think about things, and you'll notice that you're full of more ideas, you're more calm, and you can come up with truly useful and important ideas. The second thing is rethink strategy. So first of all, think about strategy, go back to strategy because everything is different, and keeping those 5 elements of strategy in mind, figure out what is your optimal path towards your objectives. Listen more carefully to your employees, use organization network analysis, dive a little bit deeper, try and get to full information, fill in the gaps, use qualitative research, use both metadata in passive O&A, as well as if you have the right conditions, go into the message content as well and extract actual sentiment. And then revisit workforce planning. Again, workforce planning goes in and out of fashion. It's very much in fashion these days. Everyone is looking at it. But think about not just the strategic aspect of workforce planning, think about the tactical, especially when we think about our frontline workers. And also revisit scenario planning, because the future is even more uncertain, right? We live now in a tumultuous, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous world. That's tuna. That's the new VUCA. And finally, work really hard to try and solve for internal mobility. Set up that internal marketplace. And it's not just a question of technology. It's really more about culture and making sure that people feel comfortable in making moves internally, not just individuals, but the managers who need to be most on board with the notion of internal mobility. So let me pause there. I think we do have time, plenty of time for questions. And let me turn it back to you, David.
Thank you, Amit. And we've got a surprise for you. Al's going to join, so we're going to have a three-way question time.
Fantastic.
Oh, great seeing you. Thank you for kind words. I appreciate everything that you have done for our discipline, as well as what you shared today. David, it sounded like you had a question.
I did have a question. Amit, we're definitely going to get into the research you're doing, because I think that's going to be very interesting for a number of people that are online at the moment. But you mentioned your second law of workforce analytics. I think you must tell us what the first and third one.
Sure, absolutely. And David, thank you also for counting that article of the 3 laws of workforce planning, workforce analytics, in one of your best articles, summaries, many years ago, 2015. So these 3 laws were actually something I condensed from many years of working in people analytics. And the first law is that the demand for people analytics, and in fact all analytics, grows exponentially. And again, this seems very simple at the surface, but it's important because as you set up your people analytics team and your practice, you've got to think forward to be able to assuage the demand that's going to come. Because as soon as you produce one item, people will want more. And so you're going to have a long queue of customers at your door wanting more and more. And unless you've taken this to heart and have built into your plan and your roadmap the adequate resourcing to meet that demand, you're going to be left behind. So the demand for analytics grows exponentially. The second law we've talked about already. And the third law is that in many situations, workforce analytics trumps workforce planning. I may have to rethink the wording on this, but the thinking is that you can often get the outcomes of workforce planning, right person, right skills, right time, right job, right pay, all of these things, not necessarily by doing the immensely hard work of setting up a workforce planning agenda, but through analytics. And I liken it to the difference between the planned economy in terms of, for example, the Soviet Union in the olden days, trying to plan what's produced and figuring out what's not just production, but prices and distribution in a planned way. And we know what happened there, versus the free market, where you provide information to people, prices, if you will, and then everyone's sort of doing their own thing. And with the right objectives, values, annual goals, strategy, everyone is individually making the right decisions. So we arm people or decision makers with the right insights, and they make decisions because they are much closer to the action. And rather than somebody back in the head office trying to plan everything. These are people who are in the thick of things, who understand their business, their function in the moment, and can then make the right decisions, keeping in mind all the other decisions others are making. And you have, an equilibrium, if you will, of workforce planning solution. So that's the third law.
I think we can definitely say demand is still growing exponentially for analytics. So that's and I think all three laws still apply, which I think is really, you've obviously could look into the future as well. I mean, when you wrote that article all those years ago. Before I get you in now, I do know we want to highlight the research you're doing. Can you tell us a little bit more about the research that you're engaged in at the moment, Amit?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So, I've been in people analytics for quite some time. I've had a fairly wonderful journey, if you will. And I've started people analytics teams and I've led people analytics at a number of organizations. And what I've realized is that you can figure out, you can technology, but what's most difficult is change. And so for the last about 2 years, I've been engaged in a part-time doctoral program in organizational change and leadership, because I think that's so important. And so the research I'm doing is related to my dissertation. And it's about what I call founding people analytics leaders. These are the leaders who are the very first people analytics leaders in the company. And they're the ones who sort of bear the brunt of trying to convert HR and the organization into a more data-driven function. So through their experiences and their backgrounds, their motivations, their knowledge, and also the organizational influences that they face, I'm trying to understand sort of how do you successfhave set up a people analytics practice. So I won't say too much more about it. The survey is out in the field, and if you have been or are currently founding people analytics leader, then please fill out the survey. It's just about 15 minutes. You can find it on my LinkedIn profile if you look at my messages and posts. And if you do take part, I'd be happy to share with you the results. And I'm actually working really hard these days trying to wrap up the dissertation and hopefully graduate with a doctorate in May 2021, just a few months away.
I'm sure you'll do that, Amit. And Al, as a founding people analytics leader yourself, all the way back in the early 2000s, I mean, you might have a follow-up observational question for Amit around this.
Well, absolutely. Number one, Amit, again, I celebrate the work that you're doing. It's much needed. And when do I and others have to complete said survey?
So the deadline right now is February 16th, next Friday, I believe. But I can leave it open for a little bit longer if you need some time. I know you're very busy, and I do want your input, so I can certainly keep it open.
Well, okay, we'll make sure. So October 16th, a week from this Friday. So we got some time. Take 15 minutes. I can find 15 minutes over that time. I have a quick comment and then a question, because you and I, Amit, have known each other for a number of years, and we both have economics backgrounds. So we see the world through a similar lens. I mean, the language that you're using around scenario planning and constrained optimization, those are like, I get excited. But I also realize that not everyone comes from that same orientation. So my question is this, there's many people who aspiring to not only become people analytics professionals, but no matter your role within HR or even adjacent to HR, we have to be educated consumers of the insights that are coming down the pipe. So my question is, how do you believe that people can educate themselves on what's happening in this world of people, data, and analytics? And granted, we're at a conference, and I don't mean to, say, "Oh, come to the conference," but it's really, you can read so much, but you have to experience it. You have to kind of get in the weeds, arguably, and find out what's going on if you really want to understand what's happening. So what's your tidbit of advice to learn more about this discipline and where it's headed?
Yeah, so I would say, Al, I think going to conferences is important because you get exposed to so many points of views and so many examples, case studies, which are really, really important. And I do think, and I congratulate you on shaping PAFAO as an event where people come to learn. I've been attending for, I think, since the beginning, and each time I come away with a thick notebook of notes to digest later on, reflect upon. And so I think being out there is important. I think the current situation where things are going remote actually helps because you're able to now take part in many, many different events. I think it helps to come at it from a discipline if you can, no matter what your discipline is, there's a paradigm, a way of thinking about the way of dissecting the world. And if that's like for you and me, it's economics. If that's what brings you in and helps you to make sense of the world, then you should use that. If not, if you're sort of agnostic about a paradigm, then the advice I would give is get your hands dirty with data. So, we can talk about people analytics forever, and we can have all sorts of classes, but until you really get your hands on a data set and begin working with it, that's when it truly comes to life. Now, within the field of people analytics, I don't want to suggest that you have to be able to work with data. I think there are many roles and many opportunities where you don't necessarily have to be a statistician or econometrician to, work on the data and torture it to come up with revelations. But I think some sense of data, what it is, and it's got many different dimensions at this point, right? So I think getting your hands dirty somehow is important.
So I got one follow-up question, then David, I'll toss it over to you for a final question. Stacia and Priyanka, I think, have done a fantastic job in putting together the technology study in the people analytics space. And I had the great fortune of speaking to a leader at Netflix the other day, and she and I were going back and forth, and effectively it just came out of my mouth. And I don't know how true it is from your perspective. It's we in the people analytics discipline, even if we're again adjacent to it, we have to be educated shoppers at this point, not just good analysts, but educated shoppers, because much of the data and analytics are being managed or done in these tools now. But we have to understand how those tools work and what to do with them, arguably. So would you echo that sentiment or qualify it in any way, the need for us to be educated shoppers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and what comes to mind right away is artificial intelligence, right? Machine learning and natural language processing, things that are becoming more and more relevant. And the tools have been sharpened quite a bit, where now you can slice and dice quite nicely to cook stuff up. But not everyone is going to necessarily understand or need to understand the matrix math behind all of those tools, but some understanding of how it works. And I think at this point, there are lots of educational, tools and content just even freely available, where people can get a sense of what it is. Because I think vendors are going to continue to be at the cutting edge and use the latest technology and embed it into their platforms. And yeah, as practitioners, as consumers, as users, we really have to be quite informed about what actually is happening. So it's a black box in many senses. And I think if it remains a black box, that's going to be problematic. I think let's try and make it a gray box to begin with. So there's slightly more light coming in. We can see what's going on. Because everything at the end of the day has to be explainable. And you can't just rely on that's what the algorithm came up with. You need to understand what that algorithm did. And it becomes murkier as we get into different kinds of artificial intelligence, neural networks. going back to see what actually, how that decision came about is very difficult. So I absolutely echo your sentiment that we need to be better informed consumers, and it takes a little bit of hard work to learn a little bit more about AI and maybe even other fields.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. David?
Yeah, and I love listening to Amit because it's always very thoughtful and provocative. It always made me think. And you did that on LinkedIn the other day as well. So I think Ian Cook at Vizia started a thread. Was it around where the people analytics organization of the future should report? And your response, Amit, was quite provocative, if you don't mind me saying so. I think you said that in the future there should be no people analytics team. I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that first.
So you're right. I was trying to be provocative. And what I mean by that, and by the way, everyone, please relax. It's not going to happen if it happens for many generations. So we'll all have jobs and opportunities for quite some time. What I meant to say, and it really goes back to, I guess, the third law of workforce analytics, where it's really about the market and everything being decentralized. So when you begin a people analytics program where your HR function is perhaps not that data driven, you absolutely need something in the center. And it's been always a big debate, where should it report? To talent management, to the head of HR, to the head of finance, to technology. With the right leader, it can report pretty much anywhere. But it helps for it to report into HR and absolutely to the head of HR. But as people analytics becomes more mature, and as the team becomes more mature, and as the usage of people analytics in the company becomes almost natural, and as the products and services become dissipated, it makes sense at some point for that center of gravity in the center, where you've already established your technology platform, you've already established the definitions, you've already established certain parameters in terms of how people data are going to be used. Once that's happened, I think people analytics needs to slowly start moving out into the periphery, right? So periphery may not be the right word, but it needs to move into the functions, and it needs to move into the regions and into the businesses, because that's where, as I alluded to before, people know what's going on. And you can begin to address the real challenges that people and organizations are facing right out there. And so over time, you're going to see that, the analytics teams will slowly start migrating into particular functions and particular businesses. And at some point, it'll be a situation where you don't even think about it. And so, I sometimes use this device. I'm not sure if it's a Buddhist device or some other device, but it's a three-line poem, if you will. And it goes like this. There is nothing. There is a mountain. There is. So you may think it's a bit corny, but there's nothing before, but then we have something called people analytics. And at some point, as it reaches out into the bloodstream of the organization, into how an organization works and thinks and does business, it doesn't necessarily need to exist as an independent function. So that's just again a provocative thought. It's a mental model, something to reflect upon. But by no means am I saying that we will not have people analytics leaders and people analytics jobs.
And yeah, and hey, I agree. Unsurprisingly, I also think it would be a really healthy future state to strive towards, even if it's not going to happen over the near term. It's just that, to your point, the mental model, I think, is one that's inclusive as opposed to this up on the mountain in the cave putting some magic potions together. So, hopefully we'll start achieving that end state. Well, Amit, as always, appreciate your contribution and look forward to contributing to your study and seeing the outcomes of that research. Any closing comments, Amit?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. As you've said many times, you and I go back a ways. We're often on the same page. We're often discussing things. We've had lots of conversations, and maybe one day David can publish our people analytics love letters to one another in his blog.
Maybe. I shudder to think, but maybe. David, any closing words? I know you're going to be heading off into your evening hours out there.
Well, other than say, I mean, what a great way for me to finish the segment today with Amit, someone that's inspired me throughout my journey. And wow, 30 hours of content over 2 days. What can I say? Unbelievable. I mean, I think when we spoke, was it probably in March, when obviously it was clear that we were going to be virtual for some time, and you put together the conference at the end of April within, I don't know, it's less than 6 weeks, I think. Yeah. Amazing. And it's to see the platform that's operating today. When I was on there earlier, I think there was nearly 200 people kind of swapping messages and everything else. So it's fantastic. And I think, as Amit said, one good thing about being virtual, it does enable us to attend easier the events like this, but you've still got to put together great content that makes people stay online and watch. So keep doing the good work, and I'll be tuning in as an observer at many points over the next day. I might not be on at 2:00 in the morning UK time, I'll be perfectly honest, but I will certainly be listening to some of the sessions tomorrow.
Please do not. No, get some good sleep, and we'll have the recordings available ongoing. So yeah, come back at your leisure. But gentlemen, thank you for being who you are. Ubuntu, I am who I am because you are who you are. So super grateful for you two. You be well.